Powell believed that the discrimination his countrymen complained of was about to be made far worse by new legislation which the Labour government was proposing. A new race relations bill would make it illegal to refuse housing, employment or public services to people because of their ethnic background. The legislation was meant to stop the victimization of immigrants, but Powell believed it would result in the victimization of whites instead.
The discrimination and the deprivation, the sense of alarm and of resentment lie not with the immigrant population, but with those among whom they have come and are still coming. This is why to enact legislation of the kind before Parliament at this moment is to risk throwing a match onto gunpowder.
Powell profoundly opposed the race relations bill, but he was out of step with many of his conservative colleagues. Powell believed that the liberal establishment of politicians, journalists and church leaders had deliberately ignored the concerns of ordinary people.
There could be no grosser misconception of the realities than is entertained by those who vociferously demand legislation, as they call it, against discrimination, whether they be leader writers of the same kidney and sometimes on the very same newspapers as those which year after year in the 1930s tried to blind this country to the rising peril which confronted it, or archbishops who live in palaces faring delicately with the bedclothes pulled right up over their heads.
Underlying Powell's speech was a deep-seated fear. He believed that immigration was fatally weakening the racial, religious and cultural ties that had bound his country together for centuries.
All of us need an identity which unites us with our neighbours, our countrymen, those people who are subject to the same rules and the same laws as us, those people with whom we might one day have to fight side by side to protect our inheritance, those people with whom we will suffer when attacked, those people whose destinies are in some way tied up with our own.
But the Labour government had recently announced an historic shift which would threaten Powell's deeply held views of what Britain was. The Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, a Liberal reformer, argued that immigrants should no longer have to integrate. Newcomers could retain their own values. It was the birth of a new way of thinking about Britain, multiculturalism. But Powell's wartime experience convinced him that this kind of diversity could only lead to violence. Powell spent 4 years in India. He was fascinated by the complexity and diversity of this ancient civilization. But he also deplored the violent divisions, above all between Hindu and Muslim, which undermined it. Powell saw how communal hatred tore India apart after independence. Around 500,000 people died during the creation of Islamic Pakistan. Powell believed Indian-style communalism was now rearing its head in his own Wolverhampton constituency.
Back in 1921, the people who ran the transport department here laid down that drivers and conductors should wear the uniform provided, and nothing but the uniform provided. They hadn't thought then of turbans coming into their town, except perhaps when Alibaba was the Christmas pantomime.
In 1968, Sikh bus drivers in Powell's constituency went on strike. They believed rules which banned the wearing of turbans and beards went against their religion. When a protester threatened to set fire to himself, the bus company backed down. Powell believed that religious and racial differences were being entrenched by the threat of violence.
Here is their means of showing that the immigrant communities can organize to consolidate their members, to agitate and campaign against their fellow citizens, and to overawe and dominate the rest.
Powell had no doubt where mass migration and race relations legislation were leading. Only months before he had visited the United States, race hate seemed to be tearing the country apart. In Chicago and Detroit, Powell witnessed violence at first hand. America seemed to be on the brink of ethnic war.
He began to feel that in 10-15 years' time, Britain would simply become the carbon copy of the United States, reproducing exactly the same sort of problems that the United States was facing at the time.
In these circumstances, nothing will suffice but that the total inflow for settlement should be reduced at once to negligible proportions, and that the necessary legislative and administrative measures should be taken without delay.
Powell ended his speech with a line from the Roman poet Virgil, which summed up his deep sense of anxiety.
As I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood.
Mr. Powell received a considerable amount of applause for what he said. There were members of Parliament and candidates and leading members of the Conservative Party there who in no way indicated any dissent from what Mr. Powell was saying at that time.
Meanwhile, footage of the speech was dispatched south. The bomb that Powell had primed was about to explode.
The tape plus the extracts from the speech, which I'd marked up for them, was put on a train to ITN in London. Who, of course, ran it big.
That evening, Powell's shadow cabinet colleagues watched in horror.
The black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
They were outraged by what they felt was his racist tone. Some threatened resignation if Powell wasn't sacked. Having had no warning of the speech, many felt betrayed.
Ted Heath was furious with Enoch Powell for saying something entirely different from what had been agreed. He would have acted even if the other colleagues had not insisted. Their insistence was absolutely in line with his own feeling.
I dismissed Mr. Powell from the Shadow Cabinet because I believed that his speech was inflammatory and liable to damage race relations in this country.
Heath had acted quickly. Powell was sacked on Sunday the 21st of April, just a day after the speech. Two days later, 1,000 dockers marched to Parliament to protest against what they called the victimization of Powell.